but about once a month we do what we call experience panels, and these are sort of highlighting segments of our member base and friends of the club in various either social or racial boundaries. So tonight we've got an Asian American experience panel. It's going to be moderated by Karen, who's a member. So I'm going to turn it over to Danny.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Ed. So, Karen, you're our moderator today. If you want to take it away, we'll let you lead.
Great. Thanks so much, Danny, and thanks so much, Ed, and thank you all my co-panelists for joining us and all the audience. We're really excited. So when we had seen the other fantastic LGC experience panels, many of us thought, hey, we really need to do an Asian American experience one. I think we're one of the fastest growing segments of the new gun community, and you know, people really don't often associate Asian Americans with owning firearms, and so let's have a conversation about that. So I thought, why don't I ask people to introduce themselves and talk about what drew them into the firearm community? Was it your family, right? Did it get passed down through your family, or was it something else? And maybe Amy, can you introduce yourself and get us started?
Yes, I'm Amy Dillon, and I'm a Marine Corps veteran, and I'm currently a firearms instructor, podcast host, and writer in the gun industry. I've been doing, I was in the military for 12 years, and I've been in the gun industry now working for about 10 years, almost 10 years. So I've been around guns and this community for the past 20 years. And that's actually how I started. Although, you know, and I never really had any experience with firearms growing up, but the first time I shot was in military boot camp. So that's how I got introduced to shooting. And now it's, you know, obviously with it being my career, it has, you know, it has a lot to do. It's my livelihood, I should say.
Wow. That's amazing. Hey, Erickson, you want to go next?
Sure. Yes, my name is Erickson Reduta. Born and raised in the San Francisco Bay Area, San Jose to be exact. Yeah, I never had guns growing up. I am a son of a veteran, Navy veteran, and my dad, you know, never had it around the house, never talked about it. I had friends who had their own pistols, guns, friends in the military, and then also friends in the Navy. It's not Navy, police officers. So they're always telling me that I should, you know, have one. But it wasn't until last year at the beginning of COVID that I felt the need for having one. Essentially when, you know, people were attacking Asian Americans because they're blaming us for bringing COVID to America. So that's when I decided to get one. And I think one of the best things about the club was I joined the club before I even bought my pistol, because I wanted to be surrounded by, you know, people who are knowledgeable, people like me, you know, people with kind of like the same thinking, and, you know, get the education that way before I decided, you know, to pick up my first gun.
Yeah. Thanks, Erickson. Hey, Trish, you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. My name's Trish Resplendor. I'm also known as TJ. Basically, I've been on and off. I've had a relationship with firearms on and off throughout my life. My first experience shooting was actually with the JROTC program. They had, you know, rifle training. So one of the first guns you shoot is a Springfield, or I should say a rifle. I didn't actually get to play with some of the bigger toys like the M4 carbine and whatnot until I went to basic training and went through the Army program as well. Didn't get a chance to stick around long enough, so I'm very like proud and admiring of Amy, since she was able to stick it out for all 12 years. But basically, I recently got into sports shooting last year with COVID. I went, you know, I'm kind of bored. I can't really travel anywhere, and I'd like to get into firearms. So I bought my first, my own personal handgun, and I'm now exploring the firearms world with all of you fine people. So I can share what it's like to be one of the newbies in the last year, and what it's like to be an Asian American in your early 30s and trying to talk about guns for the first time with your family.
Yeah, that's going to be one of our questions for sure. And the last is someone who maybe needs no introduction because many of us know him because we've watched TV and just been amazed. So Chris Cheng, Top Shot winner. Can you tell us about how you got into it and how? Yeah. Well, you know, I wanted to ask how you got so amazing, but that's a longer conversation.
Well, thank you for having me. So my name is Chris Cheng, and I'm History Channel's Top Shot Season 4 champion. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Top Shot, it's this amazing marksmanship competition for marksmen of all walks of life in all skill levels. And so my background is actually in tech in Silicon Valley. So that's actually my day job. And back in 2011, I had this whimsical notion that me as a self-taught amateur shooter could somehow go up against some of the best shooters in the world who are police officers, military, lifelong hunters, and Olympic shooters. And I ended up training really hard and ended up beating all the pros and won $100,000 and a professional shooting contract with Bass Pro Shops. And I ended up quitting my job at Google at the time to travel, travel all across the country, shooting 3-gun for Bass Pro Shops and really learning a lot about firearms culture and gun culture, which I didn't really know much about. And my introduction to firearms was through my father, who is Chinese American, and he was a U.S. Navy navigator, P-3 Orion navigator during Vietnam. So he didn't shoot guns as his primary, focus in the Navy, but he was the first generation gun owner in my family. And so when I was 6 years old, he decided that I needed to learn how to shoot. And that was just very basic firearms training to learn how to, safely handle and operate a firearm. And I grew up in Orange County, California, where at the time, there weren't a lot of gun owners, at least not that we were aware of. Sort of my family, we didn't really know a lot of other Asian families. I grew up in Mission Viejo, which is about 20 minutes south of Irvine, which is where most of the Asians live. But, being an Asian American gun owner has been a very insightful experience. And I'm definitely excited to share more of that in today's panel.
Yeah, it's odd. I think, it sounds like none of us came from like the traditional, like gun culture 1.0 type of family where, dad would take his, a gun elk hunting or deer hunting or turkey hunting, with his big red plaid jacket, that sort of vision. And, many of us are either through military or through sports shooting. What do you think accounts for this shift?
Well, I know for my family, I have a kind of interesting background because of what my dad's family experienced. Both of my parents are from the Philippines, and in World War II, Japan invaded the Philippines, and my dad's family, and my dad was six years old at the time, actually had my grandmother and my dad and my uncles, or his brothers, they had to flee their house because it was taken by the Japanese soldiers. And that, my grandfather, who was fighting with the U.S. military at the time as a Filipino, he never came back from war, and so he was declared missing. And that really started kind of the military tradition in my family. And my dad, as soon as he turned 18, because he was granted American citizenship because of my grandfather, he immediately came to the U.S. and served in the Navy. And I was born here in the United States, but I've been, back and forth between here and the Philippines, throughout my childhood. And I was lucky enough to be deployed there a few times as well when I was active duty. although he didn't take me out hunting, he did raise me to be very aware of the uniqueness of being American and having the Second Amendment, which is something that although I wasn't, actively involved as a, Second Amendment advocate when I was younger, I very much am so now. And I think being, in my 40s now, I kind of can understand the magnitude of the importance of that. And so that's why, I've developed such a passion for the Second Amendment and gun ownership, but especially as an Asian American, I never really saw others like me in the gun community that I was a part of here until more recently. So it's kind of a new experience even for me to meet other Asian Americans that are just as pro Second Amendment as I am.
It's interesting because
Go ahead, Chris.
I was going to just say it's interesting that Amy's family took that route because my family completely bifurcated. My dad's side of the family, recognizing the effects of the war, decided that they too would be or join the military. So I have one cousin who went through West Point. He's actually an officer, a commanding officer stationed at Fort Bragg. Now, my mom's side of the family, however, completely anti-gun. When they ever heard anything about the military, it was very hush-hush. It was very much, that's great for you, but let's not talk about the subject of guns. And it's interesting to see that, there's this duality in the community, that there's a love and a passion for firearms, but it's something we can't share. It's almost something we have to hide. So, I'm interested in hearing what Erickson and Chris have to say. Actually, your experience too, Karen.
Yeah. Well, I wonder, maybe Erickson, I think you and I are similar, that COVID sort of drew us both. I've had a long interest in guns. I grew up in Australia, and I can remember going rabbit hunting because rabbits are an enormous pest. And then when I came to the US and for college, just having this interest, but never really following up. But COVID was the thing that pushed me over to the edge into actually owning this feeling of people are saying we don't belong, and we do belong. And so I wonder if you, Erickson or Chris, if you want to talk about anything about how COVID has changed how you view.
Sure. Yeah, let's see. I remember, I think it was around probably February, I started asking some friends, this pandemic thing is starting to get out of hand. And, I watch a lot of movies. I play a lot of video games, even though in my late 40s, I still play. One video game came to mind. I play a lot of Tom Clancy games, and it came out a few years ago called The Division, which was pretty much, long story short, the premise of the game was someone releases a new strain of smallpox into Manhattan Island, and so many people get sick. And I think a secret division of agents go and try to pretty much bring order back to the island. So when COVID happened, I thought of that game, and I'm like, man, I don't have military experience. Friends are police officers. At the very least, I should learn how to defend my family. And, hearing the stories of Asian Americans in New York and other places where people are just coming up to them and blaming us for something we had nothing to do with, it just kind of made me want to, protect my family. So,
Yeah, and that protection of family is definitely a thing that I resonate with, and that's sort of a part of my, origin story, if you want to call it that. I think part of, to Karen, to answer your question about, what are some of the things that have contributed to this shift around increased gun ownership for Asians? Obviously, COVID has been a key driver. I think a lot of just the general rioting and unrest has really harkened back to the days of the 1992 Rodney King riots. And I know we had talked about not saying rooftop Koreans, but you know what? You just have to say rooftop Koreans to really get the point across that Korean Americans in the middle of these riots, when the LAPD was not available and they said, Koreatown, you're on your own.
Mhm.
And these Korean Americans took it upon themselves to use their personal firearms to protect their own homes, their own businesses, and really reduce the amount of destruction and death that could have been caused, right, had they not had their own firearms and exercise their Second Amendment right. And so for me, you know, my exposure to firearms was, again, through my father. And his impetus to getting a firearm was actually not because of his military background, but it was because of a story that we've seen play over and over again, which was in 1981 when the Reagan assassination attempt occurred. What happened then? There was talk about gun control and banning handguns because a handgun was used in the assassination attempt. So what did my father do? He did what so many other California residents and American citizens do when they hear about gun control and that this thing might be banned. My dad went out and he bought 2 pistols because I was 1 year old. He was a brand new father at the age of 28. And he was like, okay, I have a son and a family that I need to protect. So back to Erickson's story about wanting to protect your family. Right, this I would say is not unique to Asian Americans at all. Right, it is just a very primal, almost an instinct. Right, that we as humans we want to protect ourselves and protect our families, and so there are some of these common threads, right, that just we as Americans share with each other. But then, of course, there are these distinctly Asian American moments, such as racist comments and attacks against us, for COVID, general just racism that exists in America. But I would say on the flip side of that coin, what I've learned over the decade or so that I've been involved in firearms advocacy and helping build our community is that the firearms industry and community at large is very receptive to Asians purchasing firearms and participating in one of America's longest pastimes and one of our core fundamental rights to own a firearm to defend ourselves.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think being Asian American more explained for me more my resistance to buying a firearm than pushing me towards. I mean, in media, it was so rare to encounter like a positive image or any image of an Asian American with a firearm. And, like Grant Imahara in Mythbusters, when he, they started doing episodes with firearms, and he was like, oh my God, he has such a cool revolver. And that was like one of the few positive images, because we're never allowed to carry firearms, Asian Americans are always like at the Kung Fu or, something else. And so to see that, and then, for you, Chris, to be the top, the top shot, those were all sort of amazing moments where it's like opening up this sort of imagination that, hey, it's okay. One of the things that sort of pushed me over the precipice happened.
An important point to mention, right, is opening up our imagination. Because in my analysis and thinking about Asian American culture is that a lot of our cultures come from a place where when you're a child, your parents are often encouraging you to become a doctor, a lawyer, an accountant, an engineer, some of these very sort of safe white collar jobs, which I think many of us can appreciate where that sentiment comes from, because so many of our parents and our grandparents and great-grandparents want us to be more successful, right, than the prior generations. But opening up our imaginations, right, and seeing other Asians doing things beyond these stereotypical successful white-collar jobs, right, there are plenty of career paths where Asian Americans can be successful, right, whether it be the military, maybe it's politics, maybe it's shooting guns. Maybe it's just there's this broad array of opportunities for success in America, and being a gun owner or being in the firearms industry. But, those are paths for not just success, but a lot of fun. And also, I think, a core part of the quintessential American experience.
Yeah,
I want to
agree. Go ahead, Amy.
I wanted to piggyback off something Chris said, because So I've had the, very good fortune of being able to see Chris speak at a few, engagements in the past few years. I've seen him speak at Gun Rights Policy Conference, Rights for a Two-Way Rally 2 years ago. And I want to point something out that Chris, I've noticed that in your speeches, you lead always with, I am an Asian American. And that's how you when you're introducing yourself, you kind of define yourself first as an Asian American. And that's something that, and I never told you this, but that's something that I picked up and noticed. And, I thought to myself, I thought that was really neat that you highlighted that, because in my experience being, in this industry for the last 20 years, I've never really put myself out there as a first generation Filipino American. But I think that bringing that to, the forefront and bringing the attention on that, I think will kind of destigmatize Asian Americans owning guns. And it also, like what you said, Karen, it kind of gives other Asian Americans the opportunity to see someone and say, okay, we can be a role model. There's another person like me who is advocating for gun ownership and the Second Amendment.
I mean, and you can see it now too. I was just telling Chris before, the panel, that I was watching his videos from the National Shooting Foundation, or NSSF, and it was folks like Chris, or even before that, as a child, watching like Lucy Liu with Charlie's Angels. I mean, there were times where you're going, that's really cool. I can be a gunslinger, but I can also be really intelligent too. I can be known for more than just math and textbooks. So, like, this is an exciting experience to get into. And it's just a matter, of being creative and putting your foot out there a little bit. So again, super glad that this is happening right now.
Thanks. I had forgotten about Lucy Liu. That's fantastic.